You won't believe what they did to my property. I stood on the edge of my own land, watching a group of strangers rip apart the woods and the lake I had spent years saving for without a single ounce of permission. It wasn't just an overstep. It was a full-blown assault on my rights. But that's not even the crazy part. What happened next would send shockwaves through an entire neighborhood and change the fate of their precious resort forever. Welcome to the HOA Karen Files, the place where I uncover the shocking truth about what happens when HOAs go too far. If you've ever felt like your community was slipping into chaos, this one's for you. Don't forget to subscribe because we're diving deep into the shocking story of greed, overreach, and ultimate justice. Let's just say the tables turned and I walked away with more than I ever expected. But it all started when they tried to take what was mine. It was a crisp morning when I first set eyes on Maplewood Lake, the kind of serene place you see in paintings hanging in dentists' offices, soft pastels, perfect ripples, and an air of timeless peace. The water stretched out lazily, cradled by thick woods, with old docks sinking slowly into the mud like relics from another time. The smell of pine and wet earth hung thick in the air, a reminder that this was a place untouched by the rush of the modern world. I knew the moment I stood on the shoreline that this was where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. No more noisy neighbors, no more landlords, no more stress. It was just me, the lake, and the promise of something simpler. It had taken me 30 years of hard work, skipping vacations, working weekends, brown bagging lunches, to save enough for this slice of peace. But finally, I had done it. The property was small, barely an acre with a narrow strip of waterfront. An old fishing shack leaned against the trees, and the dock was rickety, but it was mine. No mortgage, no bills, just a quiet life I had worked so hard to build. The old man who sold it to me, Ed Whitaker, had lived there for 70 years. He fished these waters with his father before him. He gave me advice: respect the lake, and it will respect you back. And a handshake that felt like a promise. No one, not even Ed, had ever mentioned anything about an HOA. It was just land, untouched and pure. Or so I thought. The first few months were everything I dreamed they would be. I spent mornings in my canoe, afternoons clearing trails, and evenings watching the stars. The only other people around were a few old-timers like Ed and the occasional passerby. It was peace. And then came the newcomers. Shiny SUVs started kicking up dust on the gravel road. Contractors hammered away day and night, and soon enough, large homes were being built by the lake. Mansions with decks, stone chimneys, and sprawling lawns, sitting too close to the water. New families with their pressed polos and yoga pants moved in, talking loudly about stock options and property values. It wasn't long before rumors of a community improvement initiative started circulating. Bradley Keene, a wealthy commercial real estate developer, was at the helm. He was charismatic, confident, and had a tan so permanent it looked like it had been sprayed on. The papers started circulating, glossy with corporate logos and promises of preserving the beauty of the lake. But when I read the fine print, it made my blood run cold. They were planning to create a homeowners association, Sunny Shores HOA, and give themselves control of the lake itself. I refused to sign. I thought it was absurd. My deed didn't mention anything about an HOA, and the lake was mine. But Bradley and his crew had done their homework. They had the numbers. They had the lawyers. They had the gall to claim that the lake was common property under the HOA's control. A couple of signatures, a legal loophole, and suddenly the lake wasn't mine anymore. I wasn't going to stand for it. I ignored the letters, tossed them into the stove, but then came the workmen, unannounced, arriving at my shoreline to build a community fishing pier and picnic space on my land. When I confronted them, they shrugged and kept building. The HOA had already installed a garish sign right by my dock: Sunny Shores Lakefront Park, residents and guests only. That was the beginning. The fines started soon after. The first one was for failure to maintain shoreline vegetation. It was a patch of wildflowers that had been there since Ed's grandfather's day. I called the HOA office, and the cheerful young woman on the phone told me that it was a new regulation. A new regulation that, apparently, I was expected to follow, whether I liked it or not. At first, I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding, but the fines kept coming, each one more absurd than the last. Failure to maintain aesthetic standards. Non-compliance with noise abatement regulations. It was Kafkaesque. Their workers trampled across my property without permission, leaving trash, debris, and construction materials in their wake. And each time, I was hit with another fine. Bradley Keene had no respect for the lake or the people who had lived here for decades. All he cared about was turning the lake into a luxury resort, a community asset that would cater to people like him. He wanted weddings, retreats, and corporate events, all at the expense of the land and the people who had once called it home. I decided to play the long game. I knew I wasn't going to win this battle with angry protests or legal threats. They had all the power, the numbers, the money. But they didn't have the right to the lake. They couldn't just declare it common property and trample over my rights. I started documenting everything, every fine, every letter, every email. I gathered photos of their construction, their trash, their violations. I learned everything I could about property law and the covenants tied to the lake. I wasn't going to fight them with noise or anger. I was going to fight them with facts. Then came the announcement. Bradley Keene stood in front of the HOA at the quarterly meeting, his usual smug smile plastered on his face, and revealed his master plan, building a community lodge right next to my property on the East Bank. A 3-story event center, a wedding venue, a space for corporate retreats. It was going to eat up most of the shoreline. I stayed quiet. I didn't say a word. I knew what I had to do. But when the earth movers came in, tearing down the trees and turning the land into a construction zone, I knew it was time to take action. The bulldozers were digging into the earth like they had the right to do whatever they wanted, and no one seemed to care. Not the county, not the HOA, and certainly not Bradley. But I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I called my lawyer, James Hawthorne, a no-nonsense bulldog who knew how to navigate the system. When I handed him the documents and photos, he smiled, a glint in his eye. "You might have something here," he said, "maybe more than you realize." He dug into the old records. He found something buried deep in the original township filings, a covenant from 1897 that granted exclusive rights to the lake's shoreline to anyone who owned property contiguous to it. My land. I owned the lake, and Bradley Keene had no idea. What followed was a game of patience and precision. I watched as the resort was built, all the while knowing that every hammer strike, every wedding booking, every new amenity was a step closer to my victory. They didn't know it yet, but they had built their entire empire on stolen land. And when the time was right, I made my move. I sold the entire lakefront to a national resort conglomerate for hundreds of millions of dollars. The legal battle that followed left Bradley and the HOA in shambles. The resort they had spent millions building was effectively shut down, and their project was dismantled piece by piece. The money was incredible, but the real victory was knowing that I had outlasted them, that I had turned their greed into my fortune. The lake was mine again, and this time, no one could take it from me. That's the thing about greed. When it gets too big, when it starts to believe it can do whatever it wants, that's when it overreaches. And that's when it all comes crashing down. And me, I was just standing there waiting, watching it all happen. With a fishing rod in one hand, a cup of coffee in the other, watching the water return to its rightful owner. After Bradley Keene's announcement about the Sunny Shores Resort and Event Center, things began to spiral out of control at Maplewood Lake. The once quiet shore, dotted with small cottages and humble homes, now buzzed with the hum of construction equipment, and the sharp clang of hammers and saws became a constant backdrop to my peaceful mornings. The new owners of the homes near me were a different breed. It wasn't just the wealth they flaunted, but the way they had no respect for the land they had come to own. They saw it as a commodity, something to be bought and sold for profit, not a piece of natural history that had been here for generations. Their grand ideas about luxury homes, their yoga retreats, their champagne cruises, They were all built on an illusion that I refused to be part of. For weeks, I watched as the new residents transformed the area. They planted manicured gardens where wildflowers once bloomed, and they installed grandiose fences and sculptures by the water's edge. They weren't here to appreciate the land. They were here to own it, to control it, to make it conform to their version of luxury. The lake I had known and loved for so long was no longer a quiet retreat. It had become a playground for the rich, a backdrop for their Instagram posts and lavish parties. And then it happened. Bradley's first major project was announced. He wanted to build the community lodge, an event center so grand that it would host weddings, corporate retreats, and other events on the very land that was once mine. The plans called for massive construction right next to my property, the last piece of land that had still been untouched. They were going to tear down trees, level the ground, and build right over the space I cherished, the place I had dreamed of owning for my whole life. I knew then that my fight wasn't just about my house. It was about my identity, my legacy, and my connection to the land. But I also knew that fighting them head-on would be pointless. Their money, influence, and power were too much. They had lawyers, they had connections, and they had all the land. What did I have? A piece of paper, a worn-out deed, and the belief that something more important than money, something older, deeper, was at stake. I tried to ignore the noise. I told myself that the resort would never change how I felt about the lake. But as construction continued, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of helplessness. I was fighting something bigger than me, something I could never stop with just a few phone calls or complaints. One afternoon, after hearing the sound of bulldozers in the distance again, I decided to take a stand. I grabbed my phone, took photos of the construction that was creeping closer and closer to my land, and tried one last time to reason with the HOA. I called, but all I got was an impersonal voicemail, followed by an even more impersonal response from one of their lawyers. I was just another disgruntled homeowner, another holdout, someone too stubborn to see the bigger picture. The next day I received a notice, slipped under my door in bright, angry blue. Violation of aesthetic standards, $500 fine. The reasoning? I had a patch of wildflowers growing near my dock. A wildflower patch that had been there since Ed's grandfather had built the shack. But now it was unsightly. They had standards. They had rules. It didn't take long before the fines started escalating. It wasn't just about the wildflowers anymore. They found something else. A crack in my old fishing shack, a peeling paint on my dock, and even the trees I had planted too close to their newly paved road. Each fine was like a slap in the face. Every notice was a reminder that I was losing control over the very land I had once called my own. Bradley and his crew of wealthy investors didn't care. They kept plowing ahead, tearing down trees, building fences, and constructing their overpriced event center. They didn't see me as a neighbor. They saw me as an obstacle. To them, my resistance was an inconvenience, a minor issue that could be swept away with enough money. And yet every day, I watched from my porch as they moved forward, my frustration growing with each passing moment. The peaceful mornings in my canoe became harder to enjoy as the sound of chainsaws and drilling filled the air. But I knew something they didn't. The land had been here long before their shiny SUVs, their money, and their resorts, and it would be here long after they were gone. I needed a new plan, a different way to fight back, a way to stand my ground. I started by hiring a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but James Hawthorne, a bulldog of a man who wore ill-fitting suits and had a reputation for taking on the biggest, nastiest cases. He was no stranger to real estate disputes, and he understood how to use the law as a weapon. I explained the situation to him, told him everything I had seen, everything I had endured, and he listened carefully. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and smiled. "You've got something here," he said, his voice low and full of promise. "We just need to figure out how to use it." The waiting game wasn't easy, especially when you could see the massive changes happening every single day. The once peaceful lake was now slowly morphing into a bustling resort. Each day brought new developments, and it felt like the entire community was moving at breakneck speed, without a single thought for the damage being done to the land and water. Bradley Keene, ever the opportunist, continued to sell the dream. Sunny Shores Resort, they called it, a place of luxury with pristine event halls, high-end wedding venues, and the promise of high-end property values. The emails, flyers, and glossy brochures started flooding in. They made Sunny Shores sound like paradise, a place everyone wanted to be a part of. But for me, the truth was obvious. This wasn't about community. This was about profit. They were turning what was once my sanctuary into a playground for the wealthy. They were paving over history, replacing old forests with corporate venues, and completely disregarding the very soul of the lake. The environmental impact was immense, but more than that, it was a violation of what had been protected by that ancient covenant. The idea that they could lay claim to it, with their shiny resort and their perfectly manicured lawns, was nothing short of infuriating. I kept my distance from them. Bradley and the HOA members wore their power like a badge, and I knew that pushing back too soon could risk what little ground I had left. Instead, I observed, documented, and quietly built my case. Every event they hosted, every construction project that breached the lakefront boundaries, every fine they sent my way, was carefully cataloged. Then, as promised, the day came. I stood at the edge of the lake, watching them from a distance. The first official day of the resort's operations. It was a grand spectacle. The event center was sparkling, the boats were lined up on the marina, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Champagne glasses clinked, and I could hear the faint hum of music drifting across the water. It felt surreal, watching the very thing I had tried to prevent come to life. But I had to keep my cool. I couldn't act hastily. After months of gathering evidence and learning everything there was to know about property law, the day finally arrived to execute the plan. I had James and his legal team ready. We were prepared for this moment, the legal challenge that would rock the very foundation of the resort. I remember the feeling of finally filing the legal documents, submitting them to the county clerk's office. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that the deed was done and the clock was ticking for Bradley and his shiny new empire. I had waited for months, played the game, and now it was time to take the control back. The next day, everything changed. The media caught wind of the legal challenge, and the local paper published an article about the impending lawsuit. The story quickly spread. The attention shifted. Investors, developers, and property owners all began to question the legality of the resort. What had once seemed like an unstoppable force was suddenly facing an existential crisis. Bradley Keene, who had been so smug just days before, began to crack. His team scrambled to handle the situation, trying to reassure the public that everything was above board. But the truth was, they had built an empire on stolen ground, and now they were about to lose it all. The phone calls came pouring in. Offers, demands, threats, and desperate attempts to settle. I knew it was time. It was time to make them pay for their greed. The bidding war began. There were quiet whispers from powerful players, resort conglomerates, private equity firms, and real estate giants. They all knew that the land under the lake, the very heart of the project, was now up for grabs. And with that knowledge came power. I smiled to myself. The tables had turned. I didn't need to take the resort down with lawsuits or public protests. I was going to take it down with something far more satisfying: money. The weeks after filing the legal challenge were a whirlwind of pressure and tense anticipation. I had never felt so much like an observer in my own life. Each day, new developments came to light. Media outlets picked up on the legal battle surrounding the resort, and suddenly it wasn't just a small-town dispute. It was a story that had captured the attention of property investors, environmental groups, and local residents alike. Everyone had something to say about the fight over Maplewood Lake. Bradley Keene, who had been so confident in his resort, now found himself playing defense. The meetings he once conducted with charm and bravado were now filled with whispers, panic, and frantic phone calls. Each time I drove by the resort, I could see the toll it was taking on him. He was a man used to getting his way, and the reality of a legal battle he wasn't prepared for was starting to set in. But I wasn't about to gloat. I knew better than to show my hand too early. Patience was key, And I had already waited so long for this moment. I watched from the sidelines as the resort's operations slowed, investors grew nervous, and the once sure success story began to crumble. It was exactly what I wanted. Then came the first settlement offer. A local real estate firm reached out with a proposal. They wanted to buy the rights to the lake. The price they offered was generous, but I wasn't interested in playing small. I wanted Bradley, I wanted the HOA, and I wanted to make sure they understood that they couldn't trample on my rights without facing the consequences. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I called James Hawthorne. We had already discussed what to do once the offers began rolling in, and now it was time to move forward with the real plan. We needed more leverage, more than what they thought they could afford. Bradley's next move was to organize a meeting. It was clear now that he was desperate. He invited me to a closed-door conversation, the kind of meeting where no one else would be privy to the details, where we could negotiate in private. It was a calculated move. He knew he had to do something drastic to stop the bleeding. I wasn't sure what to expect, but when I arrived at the resort's makeshift office, I saw something that made me feel more confident than ever. Desperation. As I stepped into the conference room, Bradley was already there, standing at the head of the table with his arms crossed. His usual swagger was gone. He looked tense, like a cornered animal. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the sound of my boots tapping against the polished floor. He didn't greet me at first. Instead, he gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down," he said, his voice lacking the usual confidence. I took my seat, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. Everything I had been building towards. I wasn't just here to negotiate, I was here to win. Bradley sighed, rubbing his temples before finally speaking. "Look, I get it. You don't want to sell, but you've got to understand something. This isn't just about you. It's about the community, about the future of this place. People are counting on this project." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together. "The future of this place?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "The people? Or is it about you getting your hands on a piece of land that you had no right to begin with?" His eyes flashed with irritation. "That's not what this is about. You're holding up progress, everyone else is on board, and you're the only one standing in the way." I smiled inwardly. He was starting to crack. The wheels were turning. "You don't get it, do you? It was never about me standing in the way of progress. It was about you and your little HOA thinking you could control something that isn't yours. You can't just take what you want. You don't get to make the rules when it's not your land." Phew. Bradley's posture stiffened, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm offering you a deal," he said, sliding a thick envelope across the table. "A fair price for your land. This could all be over. You could have a fat paycheck and move on. No more headaches. Think about it." I glanced at the envelope, then back at him. "You think I'm here for money?" I chuckled. "Bradley, you have no idea what you're dealing with. This isn't about a paycheck. This is about something much bigger than that." He scoffed, leaning back in his chair as if he were dismissing me. "What's your point?" "My point," I said, "is that I've got something you don't. Something you never bothered to check. A legal agreement, a covenant. It says I own the lake, all of it. And you've built your resort on land you don't even have the right to use." I let the words hang in the air for a moment. Bradley's face went pale. His eyes flickered to the door, then back to me. "You're bluffing. There's no way that's true." I shook my head, smiling inwardly. "You should have done your homework. You've spent millions building on land that's not yours, and now you're offering me a deal? Tell me, Bradley, do you really think I'm going to accept anything from you or anyone else when the only thing standing between you and a total collapse is that little piece of paper?" Bradley looked at me, his mask of composure slipping. He was no longer the confident developer who walked into meetings like a king. He was a man who had just realized he had built a castle on quicksand. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. This is insane. If what you're saying is true, then why didn't you bring this up before?" "Because I wanted you to finish," I said calmly. "I wanted you to put your money where your mouth is. You and your HOA thought you could bulldoze over everyone who didn't play along. Now you've created something far more valuable than just a resort." You've created a golden opportunity for me, and now it's time for me to take what's mine." Bradley's hands clenched into fists. "You really think you can just take everything I've worked for? You can't destroy this place. It's too big, too important." I leaned forward, matching his intensity. "No, Bradley. What you don't understand is that you already destroyed it. You're standing on a foundation built on lies, manipulation, and greed. You can't buy your way out of this. You're about to learn that the hard way." The tension in the room was thick. I could feel Bradley's frustration building, and yet I stayed calm. I knew this was just a play for time. He was running out of options, and he didn't even realize it yet. He shifted in his seat, the facade of confidence completely gone. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I looked at him, not with pity, but with the cold satisfaction of knowing I had won. "I want you to leave. I want you to take your HOA and your resort, and I want you to get out of my lake. And if you can't manage that, well then, I'll just take what's mine the legal way. And trust me, Bradley, that's going to hurt a lot more." Bradley's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I could see it in his eyes. He knew the game was over. "I'll be in touch," I said, standing up. "But you should really start thinking about your next move. You're running out of time." I turned to leave, and as I reached the door, I glanced back over my shoulder at Bradley. The man who thought he could control the lake was now powerless. And it felt damn good. The days following that meeting were a blur of legal wrangling, late-night calls with James, and the steady hum of paperwork piling up on my desk. I wasn't just preparing to take down the HOA. I was preparing to take everything they had worked so hard to build, and I would do it without breaking a sweat. James had been a bulldog. He got straight to work, filing legal actions against Bradley and the HOA. The plan was simple. Let the resort complete its grand opening. Let the corporate investors sink millions more into a project that was already on borrowed time. I had all the pieces in place. All I had to do now was wait for the perfect moment to strike. And then came the announcement. Sunny Shores Resort's grand opening was scheduled for the following month, and they were throwing a huge event to celebrate. A ribbon-cutting ceremony, champagne toasts, and a whole lot of self-congratulation. It was everything Bradley had worked for, the pinnacle of his so-called vision. I could almost hear the popping of corks already, but I knew better. I knew that once the resort opened its doors, it would only take one legal move to bring it all crashing down. And that move, when it came, would be swift. The invitation to the grand opening came in the mail a week later, looking like something out of an over-the-top magazine ad. The glossy paper, the fancy fonts, the promises of a new era of lakeside luxury. It all made me want to crumple it up and throw it in the fire. But instead, I slid it into my desk drawer, next to my growing stack of evidence. It would come in handy later. The night before the event, I stood outside staring out over the water. The lake had always been my refuge, my escape. I remembered Ed Whitaker's words, "Respect it, and it'll respect you." It had always been true, but now it wasn't just the water that needed to be respected. It was the land, the history, and everything that came with it. I thought about how they had desecrated it, the bulldozers tearing through the trees, the piles of concrete and debris littering my property, the trespassers who thought they could claim my land with nothing more than a signature and a handshake. They thought I wouldn't fight back, that I wouldn't have the guts to stand up to them. They were wrong. James called me that night, his voice sharp and full of purpose. "It's all set. We're filing the motion tomorrow. The clock's ticking. Are you ready?" I felt a surge of adrenaline rush through me. The time had come. I had waited long enough. "Ready," I said, and hung up the phone. The next morning I woke up early, long before the sun had a chance to rise. I went outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. The water was still, and for a moment it felt like I could almost hear the lake itself breathing. It was almost as if it were waiting, just like me. I dressed in a suit and tie, not for any special occasion, but because today was going to be a big day. Not for me, but for them. For Bradley, for the HOA, and for everyone who thought they could bulldoze over what they didn't own. I arrived at the county courthouse just as the doors were opening, my heart pounding in my chest. The legal team had been busy behind the scenes, preparing everything for this moment. Today, we were going to make the first move. The courthouse was quiet, as if the building itself knew that something important was about to happen. I walked into the clerk's office with James by my side. The papers were ready, and I handed them over. A carefully constructed motion to file a quiet title action, alongside an injunction to prevent any further development on the lake. The paperwork was flawless. It was airtight. "Are you sure this is the right time?" James asked as we sat down, waiting for the clerk to process the documents. I nodded. They've had their fun. Now it's time for them to pay the price. The day of the grand opening arrived with all the fanfare Bradley could muster. He had arranged everything down to the smallest detail. A shining new marina, a fancy event center, a ribbon-cutting ceremony, complete with champagne and speeches. There was an air of smugness, a feeling that they had truly made it, that nothing could go wrong. But as the clock ticked closer to noon, as the first guests began to arrive, something else was happening in the background. Something that would change the entire course of their carefully laid plans. A quiet email had been sent to every single guest, to every VIP attending, and to every investor Bradley had brought into the fold. It was an official notice from the county court, informing them that due to ongoing litigation, all commercial operations at Sunny Shores Resort had been suspended until further notice. The notice included a copy of the injunction filed just hours before. I had done it. I stood across the street watching as the first few guests arrived, only to see their expressions turn from excitement to confusion as they read the email on their phones. The laughter and chatter that had filled the air suddenly stopped. People began whispering, glancing around, unsure of what was happening. Bradley was already at the podium, ready for his speech. The cameras were rolling, the audience waiting for him to give the big reveal. But as soon as he stepped up to the microphone, the mood shifted. You could see the panic in his eyes. The words that had been scripted for him now felt hollow, like he was talking to a room full of ghosts. Before he could even start, one of the county officials walked up to the stage, holding the court order in his hands. The official's voice rang clear over the speakers, cutting through Bradley's planned speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I regret to inform you that due to legal issues, the grand opening of Sunny Shores Resort must be postponed until further notice." Bradley froze. The crowd fell silent, and that was when the truth hit. The resort wasn't just facing a small setback. They were facing the beginning of their downfall. The silence that followed the announcement was deafening. Bradley, still holding the microphone, seemed to crumble before everyone's eyes. His carefully rehearsed speech, filled with promises of wealth and prosperity, was nothing but empty words now. The county official, a tall man with a stern look, stepped forward and handed Bradley the court order. "I'm afraid the ceremony can't proceed, Mr. Keene," he said calmly, his voice echoing through the loudspeakers. Bradley looked at the paper, his face turning a shade of red that nearly matched the logo emblazoned across his chest. He stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control, but the weight of the situation was too much. The room, once buzzing with excitement and the clinking of glasses, had become eerily quiet. The laughter and chatter had vanished. I don't understand," Bradley finally managed to say, his voice shaky. "We've planned this for months. There must be a mistake." "Oh, there's no mistake, Mr. Keene," the county official replied, his voice as smooth as butter. "The mistake was made when you decided to build a resort on land that didn't belong to you. And now it's time to answer for that." The crowd began to murmur. Whispers of confusion and disbelief spread like wildfire. The people who had attended this event to celebrate Bradley's grand vision were now faced with the sudden reality that everything they had been promised was a house of cards, ready to collapse. It wasn't just a setback, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Bradley's face twisted in anger, his pride shattered. He turned to the audience, trying to salvage the situation, but the damage had already been done. He could see the disappointed glances of investors, the confused faces of guests, and the doubt creeping into the eyes of his board members. "What are you going to do about this?" Bradley asked, now facing the official with desperation in his voice. "We have contracts, we have investors, we have a plan. You can't just shut us down." The official remained calm. unaffected by Bradley's desperation. The only plan we'll be following is the legal one. The fallout from the announcement was swift. Within hours, media outlets were covering the story, spreading it like wildfire across the county. The Sunny Shores Resort, once touted as the future of luxury lakeside living, was now embroiled in a legal battle that no one could have foreseen. Bradley's investors were in a panic. Those who had backed the resort project, throwing money into what they thought was a lucrative business opportunity, now found themselves staring at a project in freefall. They had no control, no legal ground to stand on, and no way to recoup the money they had spent. As for the HOA board members, they were on edge. The ones who had been so eager to push their agenda through were now scrambling to figure out what went wrong. Some of them tried to distance themselves from the debacle, claiming they had been misled. Others stood their ground, arguing that the development was a good thing for the community, but it was clear that their credibility had been shredded. I sat back in my armchair, watching it all unfold from the comfort of my home. The sun was beginning to set over the lake, casting a soft golden light over the water. It was peaceful again, the quiet, the calm. It was exactly what I had fought for. But I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed. It was James, his number flashing on the screen. "Are you watching the news?" he asked when I answered. "I am," I replied. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" James chuckled. "I can't believe they're this far into it and still didn't think anyone would notice. Their empire's crumbling, and now they're scrambling. It's going to get ugly." I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, but there was something else there too, a sense of finality. "We're not done yet," I said. "Not until the last piece falls into place." James agreed, but we both knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The resort had just started its descent into chaos. The legal battle had only begun, and the repercussions were going to echo through the community for years. In the days that followed the opening debacle, things began to move quickly. The media covered every angle of the story, from the community's shock to the investors' dismay. Public opinion shifted almost overnight, and what had once been a shiny new jewel on the lake became a symbol of corporate greed and entitlement. But this wasn't the end for me. I wasn't interested in watching from the sidelines while they scrambled to salvage what was left of their project. No, I had a better idea. The first serious offer came from a private equity firm. They were big players in the resort business, and they knew how to handle distressed assets. They were willing to offer a sizable sum for the resort's land, the infrastructure, and even the lake access itself. They understood something that the HOA hadn't. Without the lake, their resort was useless. I didn't respond right away. I let the offer sit for a few days, letting the pressure build. The calls kept coming, and each offer became more enticing than the last. It wasn't just the resort anymore. It was the lake, the land, and everything that came with it. They wanted control, and they were willing to pay handsomely for it. But I wasn't in any rush. I knew the true value of the lake, and I knew that Bradley and his crew were on the edge of losing everything. The longer I waited, the higher the price would go. Finally, the deal came. A national resort conglomerate, one with deep pockets and an appetite for expansion, made me an offer I couldn't refuse. They understood the land better than anyone. They knew that with the rights to the lake, they could turn it into something far more valuable than the Sunny Shores Resort ever could be. I signed the deal that day. The contract was flawless, and the price? More money than I had ever imagined in my wildest dreams. Bradley Keene's empire, built on lies and deceit, crumbled within hours of the deal being finalized. The corporate attorneys descended on the Sunny Shores Resort like vultures, slapping cease and desist orders on every part of their operations. Within a week, the resort was shut down, its doors closed for good. Bradley had thought he could build a legacy. He had believed he was invincible, that the lake and the community were his for the taking. But in the end, it was me who walked away with the last laugh. I didn't just sell a piece of land, I sold the dream they had built, the dream that never belonged to them in the first place. The day of reckoning had come, and I could already feel the storm brewing in the air. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a soft glow over Maplewood Lake, where everything had started. I stood at the edge of the water, taking in the stillness. The lake that had once been my sanctuary was now a battleground, and the last pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place. I had learned a lot since the day I first set foot on this land. I'd learned the value of patience, the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity, and the kind of people who will stop at nothing to get what they want, even if it means stepping on everyone in their path. And now, as I stared out over the water, I couldn't help but smile. Bradley Keene and his HOA had thought they could bulldoze their way to victory, but they had underestimated me. They had underestimated my resolve, my patience, and most importantly, my knowledge of the law. The resort they had built, all the grandeur, the big speeches, the press releases, the fake smiles, it was all built on stolen land, and it was about to crumble. And I was the one who was going to make it happen. James Hawthorne had been a constant ally throughout this entire ordeal. His sharp mind, relentless drive, and understanding of the legal landscape had been instrumental in our strategy. It was his idea to wait, to let them dig their own grave while we quietly gathered evidence, setting the stage for the grand finale. Now, as the paperwork was ready to be filed, the final pieces of evidence were in place, and the offer from the resort company was on the table, I knew it was time to act. The moment I signed those final papers, I could already picture Bradley's face as he realized the full extent of his mistake. He had played the game of power, but now he would be the one who lost everything. The phone call came at exactly 2:30 p.m. I had been waiting for it. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and matter-of-fact. "Mr. Turner, the deal is done. The wire transfer has gone through. You've just sold Maplewood Lake for, well, let's just say the number's higher than you'd ever dreamed. The resort is officially under new ownership." My heart skipped a beat, but there was no time for celebration. Not yet. I looked out over the lake again, the quiet before the storm, the stillness that only I seemed to recognize as the calm before everything would change. I had my money now. But it wasn't just about the money, it was about something deeper. It was about standing up to a system that had tried to push me out. It was about showing Bradley and his crew that they couldn't just take what wasn't theirs and get away with it. The next day, the cease and desist letters were delivered. The entire Sunny Shores Resort, with all its glimmering promises and overpriced attractions, was officially shut down. I watched as the first wave of corporate lawyers descended upon the resort, their briefcases packed with documents, their faces grim. Within hours, the entire operation was grinding to a halt. Bradley's carefully crafted empire began to crumble like a house of cards. Weddings were canceled. Corporate retreats evaporated. The event center, which had been Bradley's pride and joy, was now locked up, its grandiose facade mocking him. The marina, the boat rentals, the wine cruises, all of it ceased to exist, reduced to empty, lifeless spaces. I couldn't help but smile at the irony. For all the noise Bradley had made about his vision for Sunny Shores, none of it meant anything when he didn't even own the land beneath his feet. As the weeks passed, the once vibrant resort began to rot from the inside out. The event center sat empty, its floors gathering dust. The shiny boats that had been parked in the marina now sat abandoned, their hulls streaked with rust. The streets that had been lined with corporate banners and tourists now echoed with silence. The news crews had arrived, of course, capturing every moment of the collapse. Local stations ran story after story about the disastrous turn of events, interviewing angry brides-to-be, frustrated business owners, and confused residents. It was a public relations nightmare for Bradley, and he didn't seem to know how to spin it. But for me, it was more than just watching the chaos unfold. It was a quiet, personal victory. I had stood my ground, and now the lake, the land that had been mine all along, was free once again. The lawsuits came shortly after. Bradley and the HOA filed everything they could, hoping to salvage their reputations. But it was too late. The courts were on my side. My lawyers had all the evidence they needed, and now the truth was out in the open. Every shady deal, every forged signature, every misstep had been exposed. James had predicted this. As the lawsuits piled up, the resort's investors began to pull out, one by one. Bradley was left with nothing but a heap of debt and a tarnished name. I took a final trip to the resort site a few months later. The construction cranes were gone, replaced by a handful of workers who were cleaning up the mess. The old docks, once battered and worn, were now abandoned, their wood weathered and rotting. I stood there watching the workers dismantle the last remnants of the event center. The place that had once been a symbol of Bradley's ambition was now nothing but a shell, falling apart under the weight of its own failure. And then I heard it, the soft lapping of the water against the shore, the rustling of the trees in the wind, the distant call of a loon. Maplewood Lake, my lake, was still here. It had survived the greed and the destruction. It had survived Bradley. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I leaned back against the worn dock and closed my eyes. The lake was quiet again, peaceful, the way it was meant to be. Some battles you fight with force, some you fight with fire, but the sweetest victories, the ones that make everything worthwhile, come when you stand your ground, wait patiently, and let the world collapse around you. And that's exactly what happened. I had won, not with anger or revenge, but with the power of patience, the law, and the truth. The best part? I was still here, at peace. The lake was still here, at peace. And Bradley Keene? He was nowhere to be found. And that, my friends, is how the tables turned. From being the target of an HOA's relentless greed to watching their empire crumble, this was more than just a victory. It was a lesson in standing your ground and knowing when to fight back. Sometimes the best revenge is watching them squirm while you walk away with what's rightfully yours. If this story left you speechless, or if you've ever had an HOA try to overstep its bounds, make sure you subscribe to the HOA Karen Files. You won't want to miss the next wild story of what happens when these so-called community leaders get too big for their britches. Drop a comment below telling me what you think will happen next in this saga. Because trust me, we're just getting started. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when the next shocking tale unfolds. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.